Thank you for coming to Theology Matters. This is the beginning of our series of 4. Tonight we have a conversation about immigrants and refugees, church teaching, and a faithful response. I am so glad to have you all here and to welcome you to St. Pius X. And this series of events that is sponsored by not just Pius, but mostly through the graciousness of Creighton University and the Graff Chair of the Theology Department. So we are most grateful, and tonight we welcome Dr. Tom Kelly. To begin, we will start with prayer, and you all should have a prayer on your sheets. Make room for our new arrivals. There's quite a bit of room at the front. We apologize for this late breaking air conditioning problem. There's fans at the front, several of them, lots of room. Cindy Johnson will lead us in our prayer.
The other Cindy said that you have the prayer on your table. There's a little bit of an introduction to this prayer. I actually found this on a website for the Christian Reformed Church, but it's very fitting for tonight. Brothers and sisters in Christ, we need to pray about the U.S. immigration system. We are a nation of immigrants, and even though there are different opinions on what to do, we have to recognize that the farmers, the business owners, the low-skilled workers, and the immigrant families of today are all telling us the system has become inhumane. Congress is stuck. They've run out of answers. We believe that God's law is the ultimate authority, and we believe that God listens to intercessory prayers. As a church with immigrant ancestors living in a nation of immigrants, God is calling us to pray and to lay these issues at the feet of our King. And I'll read the unbold areas, and I'll ask you to pray in unison on the bold areas. Lover of all humankind, you call us to be caring and hospitable towards strangers in our midst. When brothers and sisters from other countries flee the difficulties of their land, help us to welcome and to walk gently with them. When students and visitors from far away choose our land as their destination, help us to respond in kindness to their interests and needs. We pray especially for those living in fear, those who risk deportation and imprisonment. We pray for the undocumented immigrants in our country, and we pray for a better system one day. As citizens, we acknowledge the Spirit's work in human government for the welfare of the people, for justice among the poor, for mercy toward the prisoner against the inhuman oppression of humanity. We pray for wisdom and guidance for our legislators, for those who govern, and for those deciding how to structure our immigration system. We pray that the need for dignity, respect, and better treatment of the strangers in our midst will outweigh the drive for political gain. We hear the Spirit's call to love one another, opposing discrimination of race or sex, inviting us to accept one another. We ask for the ability to love without bounds and to give respect to those around us, including our immigrant neighbor. Hear our prayer, O Lord. Hear our prayer. Amen.
Thank you, Cindy. I want to invite you all to get refreshments. If you didn't when you came in, you can get them now. And for anybody who's not familiar with our parish, restrooms are straight out through these double doors, straight ahead to the wall and down the hall to your right. On your tables you have some additional handouts that I wanted to mention to you. One of them is called the St. Pius X Catholic Social Teaching Interest Sheet. That's a form we'll have you fill out towards the end of the evening after Dr. Kelly's presentation, and you hear some more about some upcoming opportunities. You should have a full sheet of paper that says Theology Matters, conversation about immigrants and refugees, next steps, opportunities to respond in this year of mercy. This is a page page to take home, put it on your refrigerator, enter these dates in your phone, on your computer, wherever you keep all that good information, so you will know when these events are happening, and hopefully you'll be able to join us for many of them. We'll go over that a little bit later as well. When you came in, there was a sign-in paper on the table so that you could let us know of your interest to be invited to, specifically through email or a phone call, to the other Theology Matters and other opportunities that we'll have here at St. Pius and as follow-up to tonight. So make sure you've signed in on that paper if you want us to keep in contact. There's also a page that says crossing the U.S. border to ask for asylum. This is for women and children who are seeking asylum. Tonight you have the opportunity to sign this petition that will, where we will ask our members of the Nebraska Congressional Delegation to change the law in Nebraska so women and children seeking asylum are not detained in prisons. So we ask you to sign that petition as well. So at this time, we're going to move on to Dr. Kelly, and he's going to speak with us for a good period of time, and then we'll have a conversation, invite your comments and any questions you have. We've got a little slide here if I can make this thing work. There is an up. Colleen pushed something. I'm not sure which one it was. Is it this advance? It had 2 steps, not just one. Okay. Cindy Johnson will bring a microphone to you if you raise your hand and you have a question. And that way, you don't have to move. She can move fast. And we ask people to limit themselves to one comment or one question, at least until everybody else in the room has had a chance to respond. And please, if it's a question, please frame it as a question so that we can respect each other's time and hear from as many people as possible. To introduce Dr. Kelly is an honor for me. I've known him for, 15, 18, 20 years, and have attended some of his courses, although was never able to get into a program because of work and children. So this is quite an honor for all of us as well. Dr. Kelly has taught many courses about Latin America on the past and the present ministry of the Catholic Church. He's taken students to the Dominican Republic, to Bolivia, to Peru, El Salvador over the last 13 years. He's also in charge of the Ignatian College program for academics, and so provosts and deans, the upper echelon of the colleges, have the opportunity to go to Latin America also. Tom's in charge of this program, and he also accompanies them to the border and helps them talk to the immigrants and begin their process of immersion. He's published nationally and internationally. He has done a lot of work on liberation theology, Catholic social thought, and of course the church in Latin America. I'm eager to read his most recent books on Bishop Rutilio Grande, who's the first Jesuit that was assassinated in El Salvador and who was the mentor of Oscar Romero. So one should also know that Tom and his wife Lisa and their 3 children frequently spent summers and sabbaticals in Latin America, and he has many stories to share there as well. He has not just a heart for the poor, he finds great joy and great hope in the lives they live, and he'll share that with you as well, and how we can respond and how our church calls us to respond to the immigrants and the refugees that we have an opportunity to meet. So, Dr. Tom Kelly.
It's so good to be here. It's great to see so many familiar faces from my earlier days at Pius. So thank you for coming back, and new faces as well. So I want to clarify that tonight I'm speaking to you primarily as a theologian, someone who is trying to show you what the church's teaching is on immigrants and refugees. But I also speak to you as a person who has lived in Latin America, all told, for 3 or 4 years. And I've sat and listened to the people and why they want to come north. I do, as Cindy mentioned, immersions for the Ignatian Colleagues program, where we go to the border and simply listen to people's stories. So there's also an experiential aspect to this. I'm not simply someone who lives in the ivory tower and writes or thinks about this. I've had encounters that are very powerful that I hope will come through as I present. I thought the way I would begin tonight is to look at what I would roughly characterize as the 4 waves of immigration over the past 30, 35 years. And I'm being very general here. And the reason why I want to mention these is because oftentimes we don't recognize that we are the reason for many of the refugees and immigrants that come here. We think that it's only about problems down in Latin America, when in fact many of those problems were created directly or indirectly by our country's foreign policy. So I think it's important to remind ourselves of some of the causes of migration. And that way we're not just worried about charity, which is dealing with the immediate needs of people at the border. We're also concerned about justice, right? Which gets at the roots of these issues and says, let's change or shift the roots, okay? So again, I'm speaking very generally. But in 1970, there were 9.6 million foreign-born people in this country. And in 2010, there were 40 million. And in between those years, there were different waves of movement north and reasons for that movement. So I want to ask ourselves, what are some of the causes? Why are people coming north? And not just people, but why are parents sending their little children without even their supervision north? None of us can imagine doing that with our own children. So there must be really good reasons why people do that. The first reason was the wars of the 70s and 80s. We were deeply involved in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua throughout the late 70s, early 80s, and early 90s. There was massive flight when you have war anywhere, just like there is today with Syria. And it was so obvious why they came that Reagan just gave a blanket amnesty to people who came as refugees, which in some ways was the most just thing to do. The vast majority of them were Salvadoran, and the vast majority settled in Houston and Los Angeles. And remember that first wave, because it has to do with the 4th wave. Remember the children that came up from El Salvador and settled in Los Angeles without their families, who had been killed or whatever, because they will come back and continue to be a reason for immigration. The second cause was NAFTA. Many of you may remember in 1994, Congress passed the North American Free Trade Agreement. Bill Clinton was president. And one of the stipulations of that agreement was that after 10 years, the governments of Mexico had to stop subsidizing the agricultural industry of Mexico. Now, do we subsidize our agricultural industry here in the United States? Anybody want to guess at the quantities of money that we subsidize with? Hundreds of billions of dollars, that's right. But when they signed this agreement, they agreed to not subsidize their farmers after 2004. So in 2004, the subsidies were cut off, and we got 1 million agricultural workers looking for work in the north, because they have families to feed and lives to live and all those other reasons. So that was a huge reason for northward movement. Third, we are a great consumer of drugs, illegal drugs. We are the #1 market for drugs for all of Latin America. And when they move everything from methamphetamines to cocaine to marijuana across the border, it's because we want it. Okay? They just caught, I don't know if you read the paper today, they just got a car with $3 million in cash crossing in San Diego. When you have that kind of money and you can build your own private armies in your own country, you destabilize the governments of those countries, and you essentially function as a second government. And so today, I would argue that Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador are actually failed states, largely because of the drug cartels. Now, what that means, if it becomes an official designation, is that the people that come from those countries are not migrants. They're refugees. Now, that hasn't happened yet, because if it did, we would have to set up refugee camps on the border and actually house them, and the UN would have to be involved. And so there's the refusal to do that. But if you talk to people at the border about what's going on in their countries, there's no way I would stay there. Absolutely no way. My second son right now is working on the Nogales, Mexico, Arizona border with the Jesuits at the Kino Border Initiative. And he's been telling me the conversations that he's been having with people at the cafeteria on the Mexico side that they see come through. And it's really extraordinary the kinds of things that are going on in these countries. And when I take groups of people down, we sit at this cafeteria and we just listen. Because in all of the debate about migration, the one voice that's never heard is the immigrant. And so I sit there and I translate for the people that are listening, and it's just stories of their lives. And when they're done, they said that's a perfectly rational reason to try to get out of there. I don't blame them at all. But we're missing that voice. Finally, the fourth wave are the gangs. So remember the first wave, those children from El Salvador who lost their parents in the war and came up as orphans to Los Angeles? Well, they became really, really effective gang members. And they were deported in the late 1990s. They run most of El Salvador and Guatemala now. There are whole sections of the country where you cannot go into without paying a bribe to the gangs. The Economist just did a report about 3 months ago saying that the gangs in El Salvador take about 16% of the GDP of the country in extortion, just to give you a sense. So if they try to recruit you into a gang and you say no, they will kill you. So when people say, I'm fleeing the gangs, I'm coming north, if I return, they kill me, that alone is not reason for asylum. I did not know this until last January when I was on the border. But being in fear of your life is not a reason for asylum. And when you ask them, now if a migrant says, I'm afraid for my life, they immediately have to put them in an asylum hearing. And then I said, well, how do you prove this? And I never got an answer. From the ICE people, from Border Patrol, we go to each of their offices and we listen to everybody's perspective. They couldn't tell me. Okay? So those are just 4 very general reasons why people move. What I want to do now is talk to you about how the church has responded to this reality, not just here, but Francis is encouraging the churches of Europe, for example, to manage and deal with the exodus from the Middle East right now. So, before I move ahead though, I want to say that in light of church teaching, both main political parties have failed to address immigration in a morally acceptable way. So this is not, I'm not hacking for one party or another. According to church teaching, neither are doing what they should. The basis of the church's response is that we're supposed to find Christ in other people. So, as people of faith, we are called to awaken to the mysterious presence of the crucified and risen Lord in the person of the migrant. Now, there are so many biblical roots for this, where the stranger was oftentimes the way in which God came to encounter people like Abraham and Sarah. Remember on the road to Emmaus, right? The 2 apostles met Christ in the stranger who shared their meal that night together. So there's a long history of finding God in the stranger, the migrant. What's interesting about this is that this is something that John Paul II said. But the basis of it is Matthew 25. And the reason that's important is that in all the Gospels, there's only one place where you have the actual criteria for the final judgment. Right? And what's interesting about it as a final judgment story is that both the people condemned and the people saved say the same thing. Lord, when did we see you hungry, thirsty, naked, in prison, or sick? They both say that. And the answer is, insofar as you did this to the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you did it to me. Or insofar as you didn't. So it's not a test about what you know, it's a test about what you do. Right? So that's the basis of this quote is, you either treat the migrant as a person who embodies Christ or we don't. So migrants and immigrants are in our parishes and in our communities. In both our countries, we see, in both Mexico and the United States, we see much injustice and violence against them, and much suffering and despair among them because civil and church structures are still inadequate to accommodate their basic needs. So the document that I'm referencing is called Strangers No Longer. It was written in 2003 by the Mexican and North American bishops together. Someone asked me before I came here, are you going to be radical tonight? And I said, I don't have to be. The church teaching is already there doing it. It's an extraordinary document. Beautiful, very easy to read, and very clear. And the principles that I'll go through come from that document. So, in general, we can say that we judge ourselves as a community of faith by the way we treat the most vulnerable among us. When you can't protest your work conditions because you are undocumented, if you can't take your child to school because you're afraid of being deported, they are the most vulnerable people among us. They can be arrested and imprisoned for 6 months without trial and then deported. Right? And there's no reason to keep a migrant for 6 months other than the fact that private prisons are making huge amounts of money now off of them and it's good for business. So these people live every day looking over their shoulder, wondering if that knock on the door is going to be ICE because they don't have the documents. Now we can get into it further in the question and answer session, but if you tried to come here legally from Mexico, you would be waiting about 23 years. So the legal process does not actually work, which is why so many people come here undocumented. I will never use the term illegal person or illegal immigrant because I don't think people can be illegal. I think they can be undocumented. Okay. So the treatment of migrants challenges the consciences of elected officials, policymakers, enforcement officers, residents of border communities, and providers of legal aid and social services, many of whom share our Catholic faith. And there's so many layers to this issue. I've spoken to Border Patrol people, to ICE people, the immigration service that puts them in jail. There are so many layers of the justice system that have to do with this. And in many cases, they're fellow Catholics that are enforcing. Catholic teaching has a long and rich tradition in promoting hospitality and defending immigrants. So you don't have to look far or wide to actually see the sources in our faith. The scriptures and the life and model of Jesus are the basis of the church's present teaching on immigration. So it's not, we don't treat people this way because we're liberal or conservative. We treat people this way because Jesus did. So our option for the poor with regard to migrants and refugees is simply trying to imitate the actions of God. That's who we're trying to be like. In the Hebrew Scriptures, you see the model of Abraham receiving strangers and welcoming hospitality in Genesis 18. They happen to be angels. You shall not oppress an alien. You well know how it feels to be an alien from Exodus 2:9. The whole story of Scripture began with one people immigrating to another country. You shall treat the alien who resides with you no differently than the natives born among you. Have the same love for him as for yourself. Leviticus 19:34. In the New Testament, the visitation as a model of compassionate hospitality. In Luke 1:39-45, and many other examples there. The Holy Family, who were immigrants in a strange land when they had to flee to Egypt to escape Herod. So our common faith in Jesus Christ moves us to search for ways that favor a spirit of solidarity. And solidarity really means, so a lot of people confuse this term with empathy or sympathy. When I feel emotions about something, I have empathy or I have sympathy. When I actually act on behalf of another person, I'm in solidarity. So solidarity is an action on behalf of others. It's not a feeling, and we have to make sure that we distinguish those, because a lot of people feel bad about immigrants. Very few people do anything about it. Okay? And so I want to encourage this sense of action. It is a faith that transcends borders and bids us to overcome all forms of discrimination and violence, so we may build relationships that are just and loving. All right. And then a quote from Matthew 25. For I was hungry, you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. A stranger, and you welcomed me. Whatever you did for one of these least of brothers or sisters, you did it for me. So we're asked as people who believe to essentially see God in the vulnerable and in the stranger and in the migrant. And that means that's a choice. We have lots of ways to look at them. I tell the people who I take down to the border, if you're looking through certain lenses, you're seeing cheap labor. If you're looking through other lenses, you're seeing human trafficking and easy money. You could be seeing, a fellow Catholic, or you could be seeing Jesus of Nazareth. So the lens that we choose to look at people through is ultimately a choice. Love one another with mutual affection, exercise hospitality. Let mutual love continue. Do not neglect hospitality, for through it some have unknowingly entertained angels. Of course, a reference to Abraham. So the Word of God and Catholic social teaching also brings to light the causes that give rise to migrations. I've talked about 4 very broad ones, as well as the consequences that they have on the communities of origin and destination. Even within countries, there's huge impact of, for example, inter-country migration. I was in Peru this past summer, and we went out to the provinces, and everybody from the provinces have moved into Lima. There's like 12 million people now in Lima. And one of our days was a ministry toward grandparents. And these are elderly people who live completely by themselves because they've been abandoned by their families who've all gone into the cities. So there aren't just effects on our communities here, there are deep effects on communities where people have left. And in some communities, in some campos, right, small rural villages in Latin America, there are no more young people. They've all gone. Okay? And so demographically and all sorts of other ways, this affects so many people. So the modern era. Pius XII affirmed that all peoples have, quote, the right to conditions worthy of human life, and if these conditions are not present, the right to migrate. Pius XII was a little ways ago. This has been around for a long time, about 100 years. Notice it doesn't say they have to be in danger or they have to be unhappy. It just says they have a right to conditions worthy of human life. Okay? That's the only reason they need to migrate. John the 23rd said every human being has the right to freedom of movement and the right to emigrate to other countries and to take up residence there. And John Paul II said in Mexico in '93, we are called to awaken to the mysterious presence of the crucified and risen Lord in the person of the migrant. So there's something about that encounter that he wants us to see as more than just simply an undocumented person. In his 1995 message for World Migration Day, he notes that undocumented migrants are used by developed nations as a source of labor, and, quote, their contribution, rights, and dignity must be recognized. And then this is very important. He says, poverty is the cause of most migration. Ultimately, elimination of global underdevelopment is the antidote to illegal immigration. So all the trade agreements that we make with other countries, and this is why TPP is so important, directly affects the possibility of those countries to be prosperous and to help their own citizens. If we only see it as a win-lose, either we win and you lose or vice versa, we've missed it. The healthiest thing for us to do in our trade agreements and our foreign policy is to do everything we can to create a middle class in every other country of the world. Not only will they become consumers of our goods, but they will have greater stability and people staying there. But that has not been our policy, especially our trade policy. I also might want to mention here, it's interesting, I did a lot of reading on the economics of migration before this talk. And some people have claimed, some economists have claimed that Social Security would be defunct now if it weren't for the millions of migrants who pay into it because they work on false Social Security numbers and who never can claim it. So they essentially work, you have to have a Social Security number to work. So all the people here that you see working on roofs or working in the fields, they have Social Security numbers, they're just not theirs. And so they continue paying into the system and keep it going, even though they'll never get a benefit from it. Pope Benedict said on the World Day of Migrants and Refugees in 2007, In the family of Nazareth, obliged to take refuge in Egypt, we can catch a glimpse of the painful condition in which all migrants live, the hardships and humiliations, the fragility of their well-being. 2 years ago, I was on the border, and there were 2 children sitting in the Commodore, the cafeteria where we were speaking to people. One of them looked about 13 or 14, the other was about 16. And they were a brother and sister from the state of Guerrero in Mexico. Guerrero was where the student teachers were kidnapped, and 59 of them were killed, if you remember the news. And they had been held up at gunpoint by the cartels, who control all of the human movement across the border. If you try to go across without the cartel, you'll get killed or beaten. And what they do is they put a backpack on you with illegal drugs in it, and they say, we'll get you across, but you have to carry for us. When they got them across, they held them up for all the money they had. And the younger kid was so traumatized he couldn't even speak. And the girl I was talking to at the meal, and I said, what are you guys doing here? They said, our parents came up to Los Angeles 8 years ago, and they live there and they work there. And our aunt's been taking care of us, and it's too dangerous now for us in Guerrero, so we're going to meet our parents. And I said, well, what are you going to do? You just got deported. They said, we're just going to try again tomorrow. I mean, it's our parents. What are we going to do? I mean, that was the story of just these 2 kids. They'd already been robbed by the cartels. They'd already been trafficked as mules for drugs against their will. All they wanted to do was reunite with their parents. And they weren't going to stop until they did. And they didn't care if they went to jail. The immigrant family must be ensured of a real possibility of inclusion and participation in their new homeland. We'll talk about that maybe later in the question and answer. So, 5 principles emerge from the document, Strangers No Longer, that basically form the basis of the teaching which guides the church's view on migration issues. And the first is that persons have the right to find opportunities in their homeland, which is interesting because we oftentimes don't think about that. What could we do for these countries? And it's fascinating because I take immersion groups down to El Salvador, down to the Dominican Republic, and we talk to people from our embassy. What they essentially do is they represent U.S. business interests to the people of that country, but they don't really work on trying to make that country more prosperous in and of itself. So one of the things we can do is encourage the kind of development that will keep people in Nicaragua, in El Salvador, in Honduras, by helping with the right kind of business development. Not just getting markets for our goods, but by also helping with real development. Second, persons have the right to migrate to support themselves and their families. Third, sovereign nations have the right to control their borders. But the order matters. So we have every right to know who's coming into our country and to make sure we vet them, to make sure that they're not going to hurt anybody. And that's an important part of the process. Fourth, refugees and asylum seekers should be afforded protection. This is where it gets a little dicier with us. Because none of them are named refugees, because they don't come from failed states, they usually do not get that designation. And asylum seekers, I think that the successful asylum seekers are about 6% of people who apply for it. And fifth, the human dignity and human rights of undocumented migrants should be respected. So, and this is important, you don't earn your human dignity, according to Catholic social thought. You're simply given it as a creature of God, because we're all made in the image and likeness of God. So it doesn't matter what language you speak, it doesn't matter what country you're from, it doesn't matter whether you've done something good or bad, you still have dignity because it's given to you by God. And we simply are supposed to respect that. So in 2000, the U.S. bishops issued a statement on immigration that has guided the American Church's response to current and proposed immigration policies. It's called Welcoming the Stranger Among Us. This document I'm referring to is 3 years later, titled Unity and Diversity. And I'm amazed at how few people actually know about this. And again, it's very strong and very progressive. We witness the pain of our people involved in all sides of the migration phenomenon, including families devastated by the loss of loved ones. This current President Obama has deported more people than any other president and has separated families in the process. It's a continuation and an expansion of an earlier policy, but that's why I said no party is free of guilt in terms of the way we've treated migrants. Now, part of that is because he's enforcing the law that is on the books. He doesn't have a whole lot of freedom to not do that. And as the deeper polarization of politics has come about, you know, the only thing that's going to change this is both parties working together to actually frame an immigration policy that makes sense. And people have an idea of what that would look like, but we can't get them to work together. So the human dignity and human rights of all documented and undocumented migrants should be respected. Regardless of their legal status, migrants possess human dignity, and government policies that respect human rights are necessary. So it's not based upon whether they have documents or not. We urge communities to offer migrant families and workers hospitality, not hostility, along their journey. And we encourage social services, citizenship classes, community organizing efforts for improved housing, decent wages, better medical attention, and appropriate educational opportunities for immigrants and refugees. So these are just some of the things that the documents actually recommend. The bishops tell us making legal the large number of undocumented workers would help stabilize the labor market in the U.S., to preserve family unity, and to improve the standard of living in immigrant communities. And actually, that is one thing that all the economists agreed upon, was that because you have this dual wage system, one for undocumented people and one for naturalized citizens, they can constantly hurt U.S. workers by going to cheaper labor. And it also hurts cheaper labor as well. So once you make legal this group, things will begin to stabilize and improve, at least according to the bishops. The U.S. Bishops' recommendations on immigrant workers: we advocate reform of the 96 immigration laws that have undermined some basic human rights for immigrants. We join with others of goodwill in a call for legalization opportunities for the maximum number of undocumented persons. So this would obviously include the Dreamers, right? We know Dreamers, DACA is, you know, when someone is carried over when they're 2 or 3 or 4 or 14 years old, and they've worked hard in school and they've done well, and they're not documented. Those would be some of the first that we want to make sure we reward for working hard, and there are still people who want to deport them. U.S. employment-based immigration system should be reformed to feature both permanent and temporary visa programs for laborers. It's fascinating when you talk to businesses on the border, they're so angry at the government because there aren't enough visas for the workers they need. Which is why so many workers come across, because nobody would come across if they didn't get jobs. They all get jobs, so the idea is if you can get across, you'll get a reward. It just won't be legal. Okay? Washington State put out a temporary worker visa program. It filled in 7 hours. And the businesses wanted more and they couldn't get more, right? Before 9/11, there used to be a migration of people from Mexico up through San Joaquin Valley and into Washington and back every 6 months. People used to go freely back and forth across the border because they all knew they were temporary workers working in the farms and the vineyards and everything else. And then it was only in 9/11 where we shut down the border and instituted these policies where all of a sudden that freedom of movement was stopped. But people don't understand. They need my work and they want me, and if I just get past you, I'll get a job. And they do. It continues to this day. You know, so every vineyard and every farm in Washington, Oregon, and California that employs hundreds of thousands of migrants would not be able to do their work without them. So we need a system that actually rewards people who want to work and rewards businesses who need workers, and that would be expanding the worker visa program to have both permanent and temporary laborers. This is one of the resources, justiceforimmigrants.org, if people want a reference that they can look up some of the information for. It's a good website with lots of policy details. I'm not a policy person, but they have suggestions there. So we're supposed to be encouraging our elected representatives to do this comprehensive immigration reform as soon as possible. So our common faith in Jesus moves us to search for ways to treat all immigrants in a spirit of solidarity, to choose to do that. It is a faith that transcends borders and bids us to overcome all forms of discrimination and violence. Catholic teaching also states that the root causes of migration, poverty, injustice, religious intolerance, armed conflicts, must be addressed so that migrants can remain in their homeland and support their families. So it's not enough just to deal with migrants when they come here. We have to be focused on causes. And we have to be advocating for policies that stop the causes from happening in the first place. John Paul II also addressed the more controversial topic of undocumented migration. In his 1995 message for World Migration Day, he notes that such migrants are used by developed nations as a source of labor, and ultimately, again, global underdevelopment is the antidote to illegal immigration. So, by helping other countries prosper, they will have the kind of stability that will lessen the migrant flows and also become a market for our own consumer goods. So the church recognizes the right of a sovereign state to control its borders in furtherance of the common good. It also recognizes the right of human persons to migrate so they can realize their God-given rights. And these teachings, according to the bishops, complement each other. So, we stand in solidarity with you, our migrant brothers and sisters, and we will continue to advocate on your behalf for just and fair migration policies. I can talk about some possible ways to do that as we move forward through the evening. And we commit ourselves to animate communities of Christ's disciples on both sides of the border to accompany you on your journey so that yours will truly be a journey of hope, not of despair, and so that at the point of arrival you will experience that you are strangers no longer, and instead a member of God's household. We pray that whenever you go, you will always be conscious of your dignity as human beings and of your call to bring the good news of Christ, who came that, quote, we might have life and have it more abundantly. So that's essentially the church's teaching. Very generous, very open. We know that it doesn't come without problems or issues or things that we have to address. And we also know that it's going to require a shift of attitudes, even within our own communities here in Omaha. One of the things that I suggested in another talk is that, going to places like Our Lady of Guadalupe, meeting people who are part of our Catholic family who are here is one way to do it. Visiting people detained simply for the reason of being an undocumented migrant can also be very educational. Many of them have lived here for years and speak English. They've been productive and worked here for years. So lots of possibilities to actually encounter human beings and talk to them about why they made the choices they made. So I know that was quick and there was a lot of information, but that is essentially the church's approach to the topic of immigration and refugees, and I would love to open it up and take questions right now. Thank you.
You hear me?
I do.
Yes, I get a question that covers about 3 different subjects.
Okay.
All right? Okay. Quiet. All right. How can the church, or basically anybody who has been hit by a person who is a drunk driver, and he's a Hispanic, or a person who has a son who's wiped out on drugs because he got it from an Hispanic. I mean, how can the church expect us to have this open heart when we are being stomped on ourselves? I mean, I agree with what you're just saying, and I have no problems with it. It's just that I can't understand how it can be done.
Sure. Well, first of all, it's interesting because undocumented migrants in this country are actually less likely to get involved with problems of the law compared to citizens. So as a group, they're actually more lawful than we are. What you've heard are the few cases that have been highlighted by certain parts of the media that want to make this issue. Now, I would say whether they're documented or undocumented, if someone kills you, if someone's a drunk driver and kills you, it doesn't matter. It's a horrible thing that happened, okay? Now, I wouldn't punish a whole class of people simply because a couple of them made mistakes. So I think we have to look at the wider phenomenon and ask ourselves, okay, there are clearly ways we could have prevented that, right? The fact that he was released after being held for a felony is actually a problem of our law enforcement more than anything else. But I would also be careful not to overstate the fear of that. Because it really, statistically, you have more of a chance of getting robbed by a citizen of the US and hit by a drunk driver from the United States than you do who's undocumented. But you wouldn't know that from the rhetoric in the media. So I would just say that as a caution. Yeah. Well, you prosecute everybody to the extent of the law, but you begin with a comprehensive immigration reform. And you, instead of having people who are quote-unquote undocumented, you document everybody coming to the border. You give them either temporary or permanent visas. If they're criminals, you do not let them in, because there are plenty of people in the cartels who would want to come across. But you can't do that until we begin talking about a comprehensive reform. Right now, it's kind of like patching up a dam that's flooding, and we're just sticking our fingers and feet in it, hoping that we can hold it. It's crazy. So we have to sit down and address this like adults as a Congress of the United States. I mean, really. That's the only thing that's going to solve it. Others? Yeah.
My favorite story about Social Security, I was in the restaurant business for many, many years. And I had this really good waitress, her name was Maria. And she came to me one day and she was crying and she says, well, I have to go back to Mexico. My husband was picked up and then deported. And so my little boy and I are going to go back. It's like, well, it's really sad, and I'm sorry, Maria. Here's $50 and good luck. So anyway, fast forward 9 months. She shows up on my doorstep. Hi, Mr. Bill, how you doing? I says, Maria, you're back. Great. She says, well, I want to go back to work for you, but you need to understand, my name isn't Gonzalez anymore. Now my name is Martinez, and my Social Security number is different. I says, I don't care. You're a great worker. Come on in.
Yeah.
Who's going to know? And you know, so you talk about people that pay into Social Security and never get anything on it.
Yeah.
She's paid into it in 2 different names.
Right.
And she'll never get a penny.
Right.
Ever.
Yeah.
Because, you know, somebody in Texas made her a penny.
Yeah, and they don't, and before we get into this, they don't qualify for welfare. They don't qualify for, in many cases, Medicaid. So many of what they're called entitlement programs, I'm not sure why they're called that because we pay into them. But these programs that help the poor and vulnerable, they don't have access to that. They don't qualify. It's very clear in the law. They may get other forms of charity, you know, whether it's private or otherwise, but they're not a drain on that system because they're not documented. You have to be documented to get that.
A quick comment on that also is that the Nebraska Cattlemen's Association, which is all the cattle people in our state, all the ranch people, and the Omaha Chamber of Commerce both support immigration reform because they need good workers.
Thank you.
You threw a statistic out there about the wait it takes for the average Mexican to achieve citizen status in the United States, 23 years. And I know you said you're not a policy person, but do you have any more details as to why that process is so long?
Yeah, it's just a backlog. So they're dealing with, they're dealing with applications that have been put in. I think they're up to 1996 or 7 right now. It's a long time ago. Because when you go to a migration office in Mexico and you say, I'd like to immigrate to the United States, the first thing they ask you is, how much is in your bank account and do you own property in Mexico? Now this is after you've paid the $350 fee. If it's no to either of those questions, they just simply deny you, and then you can try again. If you try again, then those are in process. There's a backlog of over 20 years. And it's just because we don't have the people to do them, essentially. And it's true all over Latin America. There's an annual what?
There's a cap.
Yeah, right. Yeah, she's saying there's an annual cap every year from certain countries, and including European countries. And I was shocked to find out that there are about 500,000 illegal, undocumented migrants from Europe right now in the United States. So it's not just Latin America, which is interesting.
I'd like to clarify what immigrants, in fact, legal or otherwise, can make use of, and is it the education system the one program where perhaps we are actually serving the needs of these people?
Yeah, so schools. Again, if they have the ESL support, if they have the ability to teach, you know, the needs of these kids, yes. And it's overwhelming. It needs more resources, but You know, we have friends who teach some of the newer refugees here in Omaha in schools where they're putting them in North Omaha, etc. And it's extraordinary how important that is. Many of the programs at the OPS building down by Creighton, I forget the name of that. Yeah, the language programs that they have there are so critical. And we have to realize that when you have migrants in this country, they will be a larger drain on future resources if we don't get them productive and integrated. So the question is, you know, when someone says, well, why do we do any of this? Because if you don't give health care to people when they're at a point where they can prevent things, it's going to cost a lot more later when we can't afford it. It's not an option to simply say, we cut them up, all services away. We will be a worse society for that if we do that. And the schools probably take the brunt of that issue, for sure.
President Obama had an immigration legalization plan that he tried to institute. It was rejected. What's your comments on that?
I think he's so frustrated at the gridlock that he's trying to do anything he can. I think it was provocative. I think he was trying to show that if this is the only way I can try to get it done, it was, you know, executive. Because so much has been gridlocked over the last 8 years, I don't blame him for trying, because nothing has happened. I mean, there's just no will to actually sit down like reasonable parties and say, okay, what's best for all of us? It's so partisan right now. That would be my comment on it. Yeah. I mean, I don't think kids who were brought over here without their consent should be punished. Because I don't blame people for actions they're not responsible for. So I think the least we could have done is take care of the dreamers. I mean, that's just like a no-brainer to me. But I guess the court said it wasn't legal.
The large number of people that are currently being deported, are they being deported even if their records are free of criminal things, except just being illegal?
Yes.
If we capture people that are illegal, it doesn't matter what their family circumstances,
Right.
they're deported now?
So I met a guy who was a roofer in Phoenix, actually owned his own company for 16 years, had 4 children there in Phoenix. And when they checked his documentation, no problems with the law for 16 years, they kicked him right into Mexico. Gone. Doesn't matter how productive you are, doesn't matter how legal how well you've behaved when you're here. If you've crossed the border without consent, that is considered a criminal act. And so you're by definition a criminal. Yeah. There's no black and white. And you talk to the Border Patrol and the ICE officers, and they say, they'll tell you, you know, as they're giving you a tour of their prison, this is a crazy system. It doesn't work. But we're not policymakers, we're the people who have to actually enforce it. I asked a guy who'd been on the border for decades, and it was a little weird because it was right before the Boston bombing. And I said, how many terrorists have you stopped coming through Mexico? And he just laughed at me. He goes, all of our problems are homegrown. I haven't stopped anybody coming through this border that I would ever recognize as a terrorist. 4 months later in April, or whatever the date was in Boston, a kid who'd grown up here in the United States, radicalized here in Massachusetts, sets off the bombs. So people on the ground know how silly it is, but unless you actually go there, talk to them, see it for what it is, it just doesn't make any sense. You know, it's just sort of vague. Yeah, it's very frustrating. And so what we do when I go down for the 8 days is we literally see a different piece of it every day. And by the end of it, the people in my groups who are always both on the left and the right say, this program, this system is broken, human beings are getting hurt, and it needs to be fixed. That's where they all agree on. Now, they may disagree on different ways, but they all agree that it's broken. And that what we're doing right now is simply just not working.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks very much for your presentation. Quick question. I mean, I'm glad you highlighted, on the one hand, the bishops say we have a right to protect our borders as sovereign countries, and on the other hand, we have to welcome the stranger, and they claim that those two complement each other. Do you find a tension there, and that people will use that sovereign claim as a justification for saying, well, we can support those who want to round up and deport all undocumented workers, because even the bishops would support it in that statement?
Yeah. I do think there's a tension, but I think it's, again, the biggest tension that I see is relative to another group that we don't talk about because they don't really have a voice, and that is the cartels. The amount of firepower, the amount of technology that they have, they really do represent a threat to our borders. And we really do need people down there. The problem is that the migrant is the one caught in the middle. And that's the one who takes the brunt of our emotions. So the way it works is when you come, if you were to walk into Nogales, Mexico, and you were to look up at the hills, you would see someone on the top of each hill with binoculars. Those are cartel spotters. Okay? Right up, they run everything and they're right there. If someone tries to cross the border, they send people down. My son told me that one guy got his ear cut off the other day for trying to get across without permission. They come back, they pay the cartel a certain amount of money, and they're basically moving drugs and weapons and everything else through. So there is a tension when you have the criminal element there between sovereignty and welcoming. The problem, though, is that the 15-year-old who's trying to get out of Honduras because she doesn't want to get killed by the gangs gets taken by the cartel and trafficked as a human being. And then when she gets into the country, if she doesn't pay them almost everything she makes for the first few years, what they do is they take a picture of her license. And then they call their people in Honduras and say, you need to take out the Rodriguez family in this village. And they'll go and they'll kill her family. She doesn't pay it back. So they are blackmailed all the way through. So that's part of the problem, is how complex this is. I think that, now that's different than the simple fear-mongering. We have people who overstate the fear of the migrant because they're afraid of people who are different or of color or anything else. And they want to shut everything down. Not only is that unrealistic, it just will never happen. You know? I mean, people are going to tunnel under, they're going to go around on the ocean, they're going to go over the fence. You're not going to stop it by trying to use force. Impossible. Any more than they could stop the flow of refugees from the Middle East with force. So you have to be pragmatic to a certain degree. Politics is the art of the possible. John Paul II said that. It's not, you don't put your perfect ideals in law and have them fulfilled. That's not how the way it works. Policy is a little bit like making sausage, you know. My wife has a degree in public policy. It's not pretty the way it happens, but you have to do the possible. And we should at least start there. But I think that because our representatives have gotten away, from both parties, with not doing anything, they're perfectly happy to sit in the status quo. Doesn't affect them at all.
Question here in the back.
And I wanted to read a quick sentence from the Catechism just to give my question a little context. In 2241, where it says, immigrants are obliged to respect with gratitude the material and spiritual heritage of the country that receives them. And this is a very, very narrow question. I just want to focus on, how would you characterize the unique material and spiritual heritage of the United States?
They didn't hear the question. Basically, he read a section from the Catechism that said, migrants need to respect the material and spiritual heritage of the host country. And then he said, what do you think is the material and spiritual heritage of the United States? So, I think part of the heritage is I'm not sure it's positive in the sense of the church. I think that we have a very strong individualism that oftentimes translates into spiritual individualism, which is why so many migrants initially go toward Pentecostal and evangelical churches, because that's kind of where they're formed and what America is. They do go to Catholic churches, but they're getting fed better at those other churches. I think that a certain amount of materialism is part of our material heritage. Status items are very important to us. And actually migrants mimic that. They come and they do exactly that thing. I was at a liturgy in Guadalupe a couple months ago, and one of the priests was criticizing people putting new tires on their car, on their fancy cars, the lowrider cars, when their kids needed stuff for school. But that's precisely one of the things we do, is we tend to do the materialistic thing as opposed to, and migrants will buy right into that. On the positive side, there's a sense of self-sufficiency and responsibility that I think we should encourage, right? So I think a lot of our virtues can be good and bad, depending on how we frame them. And obviously, we have a very comfortable material existence. I mean, we have better than any other country in the world. And having lived in a few of the others, I can attest to that. So I think having the opportunity to work and to advance is a spiritual value regardless of what family you're from or what your last name is. So in certain countries you can't get past a certain level because of that elitism, that classism in certain countries. Whereas here, if you do, within certain reason, work well, you can succeed. I think that I'm not a complete, I don't think that the American dream is completely true for most people. I think it used to be more true. I think it's narrowing right now. But I think it's still possible because of the examples and the people that I know. And so that's a dream, you know, the idea that you can work hard and be successful without having to pay someone extortion is a wonderful thing, and people want to come here because of that. So I think we have a lot of really good things about our spiritual material culture, but I also think that there's dangers in it as well. You know? Yeah. Oh, there was a hand here in the middle. Okay, first Rosie.
Dr. Kelly, I had an understanding, and it may be incorrect, that crossing the border without documents was a civil violation rather than a criminal violation. And if that is actually true, how is it that the system that we're dealing with right now is able to put women and children basically in prison? I'm a little confused on all of that.
So one of the things that we go see is a thing in Phoenix called Operation Streamline. And what it does is it brings groups of migrants in front of a judge, 50 or 60. And the idea is that if you plead guilty to a second-degree misdemeanor, then they will just immediately deport you. The problem is that you can never come into the country legally with that. So what they say is, we're not going to make this a criminal offense, but you can't come back in after you plead it. And if you don't plead it, we're going to put you in jail for as long as it takes to try your case. So the laws are shifting, and even when you talk to immigration lawyers, it's amazing how much it depends upon the judgment of a judge, the ICE worker, the Border Patrol. I mean, a lot of it can be affected by stuff completely beyond the immigrant's testimony about why they're there. But I was in court one time, and this girl stood up and said, "I'm so sorry for breaking your law. I was afraid I was going to get killed in my country. I'm so sorry." It didn't make any difference. She just got her second-degree misdemeanor and deported. There was absolutely nothing that mattered about her personal story. So this group justice now, where we're moving them through in huge batches, the goal is to maximize efficiency and just keep doing the same thing we're doing. So yeah.
Okay, I have a question about the Social Security cards. I just Googled the Social Security Administration to look up the requirements. And it says to apply for an original card, you must provide at least 2 documents to prove age, identity, and U.S. citizenship or current lawful work authorized immigrant status. So how are so many people getting cards?
Well, there's a market. There's a market for fraudulent cards. People who died, and someone gives it to you, you change your ID, and you are Senor Rodriguez. Oh yeah, it's amazing how they've gamed the system. Now they don't get the benefits from that, but they're allowed to work. Yeah.
Elections don't seem to help a lot. What do you think will ultimately incent the two areas of self-interest to get together and resolve something that makes sense?
I've been told, and I don't know if this is true, I've been told that when a representative or a senator's office gets more than 20 phone calls or email about a single issue, it becomes something to respond to. If there were really widespread, if every time that Ashford came to this parish or whoever else represents us, if you said, look, why don't we have comprehensive immigration reform yet? I mean, I think that pressure will help. I think pressure from the business community, the Chamber of Commerce, and the Cattlemen's Association, where Cindy, who mentioned that, they listen to that a lot, but I think the Chamber could push it harder. But like so many other things, it moves slowly, But I just think keeping that issue out in front is one of the many things that we need to continue doing. So anytime you have an evening with a candidate, bring up the, what are you going to do about immigration reform? Just so that at least they know it's on your mind. I would, anyway. I have two hands up, I'm not sure who's first.
So you would suggest call your representatives, state your case, and call often?
Yeah.
Not just once, but call every 2 months, every 6 months.
And I also think getting involved in a personal way is always something that helps motivate me. I think that knowing people in their situation and being able to use examples, personal examples with people you talk to is really important. But yes, being active about an issue, caring about it enough to call.
Dr. Kelly, what do you see as some key points to immigration reform?
I think first our trade policy we have to change the way we deal with other countries. We have to want them to be successful where they live, number one. Number two, I think we need to have a worker visa program that works, that actually meets the demand of the market. There's been something like, I want to say 140,000 temporary worker visas given every year. The number hasn't changed in 20 years. Congress won't change it. The actual need is like 500,000 or 600,000 that businesses want. So why not respect the market and say, okay, let's do a survey of how many business owners need temporary work visas and let's give them. Because if we can track them coming in, we can track them coming out. Regularize the temporary work thing, and then also have some permanent ones. Make it easier for students to study from other countries here. That would just be the beginning of it. And then I would start changing, but I'm not, like I said, I'm not a policy person. I am completely opposed to separating families. There's a terrible video online, if you were to look up Boston deportation, like 2006. There was a factory outside of Boston that got raided by ICE one day, and 300 of the 320 workers were undocumented. So they drove them to the airport, put them on a plane, and flew them to Mexico. The next thing you see is the TV cameras outside of the grade schools, and these little 7-year-olds are coming out, waiting on the curb, and no one's there. They overwhelmed their social services because they had to take care of 300, 400, 600 children who now no longer had parents but were born here. That just doesn't make any sense to me. Economically, humanly. So the first thing I do is stop jailing women and children and stop separating families. And maybe one of the things we could do is maybe parishes could volunteer to be temporary asylum places while families wait to hear their cases. A lot of times they just wait in jail. Why not have parishes volunteer to house a family? But it's got to be personal. It's got to become more personal if we're going to make a change in the system.
Tom Kelly for governor?
No. I have no money.
We'll help you.
Well, I want you to governor.
In the NAFTA agreement, you said that one of the requirements was that the subsidies to the farmers were discontinued. What was the logic behind that, or reason?
The logic was that agricultural workers of the United States made sure that they had skin in the game and that they were going to expand their markets. The markets that weren't hurt in Mexico were the big producers that already have money and don't need government subsidies. So they weren't hurt. The ones that were hurt were the smaller businesses. So anytime we can expand a market, we do. Even if it hurts the country. So let me give you an example. When Jamaica, back in the late 1990s and early 2000s, when you get a World Bank loan, it's tied to all sorts of conditions, okay? You don't just get money that you pay back. You have to raise your interest rates, you have to lower all your tariffs on foreign goods. So what happened is they got this loan. They had to lower the tariffs on all foreign goods. We flooded their markets. We shut down their milk industry, their potato industry, their banana industry, because we can produce that stuff much more efficiently than Jamaicans can. So yes, our farmers sold more goods. And yes, we got more migrants from Jamaica coming to the United States looking for work. So we have to have a balance between, we want you to be productive, we want you to be successful, and we also want to be able to sell goods. So that's really what the skin was in the game. Yeah. And we just did the same thing with CAFTA in the Caribbean. So the Dominican Republic has to cut off its rice subsidies. Now they plant rice by hand in the DR. You know how we plant rice in Georgia? With an airplane. They can't compete with us. So we're about to destroy their rice industry because we want to export to a small island in the Caribbean. And what's happening is that everyone's going to New York City. There are over 1 million Dominican immigrants in New York right now. And that's just growing.
Yes, why don't you take and produce a PSA with this and broadcast it nationwide? I'm sure that you can probably get a lot of help from the Chancellery office. They have the equipment to do it.
By PSA, you mean? Oh. I mean, basically what I've done is I've shown the church teaching. I'm not really a policy person in the sense that I can tell you what works and doesn't work. So I'm sure there are other people who can do that better than I. What amazes me, though, is how many Catholics don't know the teaching of their own church. Now, if you decide to go against it, that's fine. But at least know what the church is teaching before you hop on someone's wagon that's not even close to what we ought to be doing. You know? What we ought to be doing.
I just wanted to thank you because I work with migrant children down at South High School, and that's where I became interested in immigration. And these stories about people being deported don't only happen way away, they happen here in this city. And sometimes they sit by the schools and they'll pick up the dads, and the kids have been known to sit in the car all day long. I mean, it breaks your heart. I mean, when I read these stories, I am crying a lot of times. But there are many kids down there who have had parents deported.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, Doctor, you mentioned the very first slide about problems with cartels and drugs. What would your recommendation? I know you tell us we should get involved in immigration reform. How would we get involved in solving the drug problem that we have in the United States?
Well, it's interesting because what did they have this morning? A guy who was on methamphetamine just caused $1 million of damage at the airport for driving the truck into. I think we can say by now that criminalizing drug use has not worked. Everybody, drug use has not gone down in the past 40 or 50 years. I think that dealing with it in terms of having resources for rehabilitation and addiction recovery, especially given the methamphetamine and opioid epidemics we now have in this country. Just reading an article that 254 people in 4 counties in 1 week died in Ohio of opioid overdoses. So I think that, you know, first of all, don't take drugs and don't take illegal drugs. Second of all, let's stop criminalizing it and start treating people for addictions, which are also a form of mental health care. So we have health care, but we still, in many places, don't have mental health care. Other countries that have drugs, and there are, you know, many of the European countries, they don't have the issues that we have because they deal with it differently. We have not pivoted on this quote-unquote war on drugs, even though law enforcement officers, I mean, you can drive down the radial and see signs that say cops against the war on drugs. It's failed. So I just think we have to be a little more creative with the way that we deal with this. And I tell students, you know, drugs do more damage in this country, especially to poor neighborhoods. So anybody who takes recreational illegal drugs, you're indirectly hurting so many people. So raising the social awareness of what it means to participate in this, you know? But it's tough when you have, you know, TV shows that glamorize meth making and, you know, from Breaking Bad to whatever else. I mean, we are a culture, it's amazing. We're the most prosperous country in the world. We supposedly have more opportunity than anybody else, and we are chronic drug takers. It's fascinating. No one even comes close in the world to what we do. There's a hand behind you, Todd. I don't know if there's a microphone.
The microphone that has been traveling around is out of juice. So David, if you can be really loud, maybe come to the center.
Hopefully just a simple question. When you say that criminalizing drug use has not worked, are you saying that as a theologian, as a policy expert, or as a private individual?
You know, it was interesting because a couple of years ago, my son told me that he doesn't know why he's going to school today, and I said, why? He goes, because it's National Weed Day. I don't know what that is, like April 20th or something. He goes, and all my friends and their parents are staying home and smoking weed. And I thought to myself, now when I was in high school, there were definitely people smoking marijuana, but we weren't doing it with our parents. And it wasn't accepted in such a sort of cavalier way. I think the drug culture has grown exponentially in this country, just as an observer, as a parent, as a person who reads the paper every day, as someone who can understand statistics. I mean, it is incredible the amount of drugs that we consume. And that's what really keeps the cartels and the drug people flush with money is us. No one else is buying them. Yeah.
So if you wanted to help people assimilate that are migrants over here, what are the agencies that you know would volunteer about?
Well, there may be other people here better qualified for me than that, but I do know that, for example, there are plenty of opportunities with Lutheran Family Services, with Catholic charities. You could learn how to teach ESL, English as a second language. I know that Guadalupe has opportunities. Again, you're moving outside your comfort zone. For some of you, you may not be able to communicate very well, and it may be a little bit awkward, but meeting people and trying to work through the language with them, it shows them that you care enough to try. As someone who's lived as a stranger in a strange land, you know, I'm always amazed when I go to Latin America how kind people are when I make a mistake in Spanish. They really are. I'm not joking. And I've seen the most horrible things at supermarkets, post offices, doctor's offices in this country when someone doesn't say something exactly right. So I think part of it is just being friendly, you know, being open to people, helping however you can. Do other people have suggestions on offices? I don't know, Pam or Lise?
We're going to talk about some other places and opportunities for people. I just wanted to add to your talking about the hospitality and the gentleness of the Mexican people, and I'm sure all the other places that you've been as well. But when I was youth minister at this parish, 5 different times I took groups of high school kids to the colonias in Tijuana and to Mexicali, which is just across the border, a couple hundred miles east of San Diego. And I went with Sesame Street Spanish, you know, just very basic words. 6 years of Latin thanks to the Notre Dame Sisters of Creighton University, which did help also on recognizing a lot of things. Many of the students had taken Spanish both at St. Pius and at the high schools that they attended. But we went to grocery stores, we went to lumber yards, and we talked to the people in the communities. And we were able to converse just fine.
I would love, you know, and another example, I would love to see, I'd love to see sort of an adopt a family thing out of parishes like Guadalupe, where you have a lot of new immigrants, and people here who want to just say, hey, come over for dinner and let's talk, let's do the best we can, let's humanize this. Regardless of your status, regardless of anything else, you're not alone here. Welcome to my home. Because I know that when I've been to Latin America, I've lived with people and stayed with people, and they've opened their doors to me in a way that we just don't really do that very often here. But I think it would humanize the issue, and it would make you see that, you know, these are people who just want a better life, just what you and I want. And when you find that commonality, I think it really changes things. So I would love to see something that concrete. Yeah.